thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining. While people is still entering and we have our usual international audience, I welcome everybody today for our webinar on the market, on the MDMA, and I will immediately give the floor to the chair. Today is Teodora Groshkova. Teodora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marika, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your location. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really pleased to welcome you to the launch of the 8th module in the EU drug markets in-depth analysis, which is dedicated to MDMA. As said, I'm Teodora Groshkova, and I'm currently coordinating aspects of the work on crime markets and precursors here at the European Union Drugs Agency. I'm particularly delighted to chair today's event, as this is the first launch of the current edition of the EU drug markets to occur under the banner of the European Union Drugs Agency, EUDA. The previous modules, for those who have followed the launch events, were under the EMCDDA banner. So during this launch event today, we'll provide an overview of the key issues surrounding the MDMA market in Europe, from production and trafficking to distribution and use. We will discuss the processes, materials, and also the criminal actors involved in various stages of this market. The large-scale production of MDMA within the European Union raises significant safety and environmental concerns, and we will also explore those broader impacts of the MDMA market. Now, at this point, I would like to highlight that the analysis we're launching today is based on triangulation of multiple sources. It draws on data from our EUDA routine monitoring systems and Europol's operational information, which is related to serious organized crime. The synthesis of these different perspectives has allowed us to provide a contemporary, strategic, and action-oriented analysis. This forms a rich and evidence-based resource to inform practices and actions. Now, you will notice during the presentations today that the various sub-analyses, which are based on different data sets, cover different timeframes, and I want to flag that. However, we ensure that the overall analysis includes data and developments at least up to 2022, despite some variability. Now, the analysis largely relies on reporting from the EU member states, and we're extremely grateful for the collaboration of our partners and their various networks of experts working in the EU member states and beyond. And we know many of these experts who have collaborated with us have tuned into this webinar launch today. So thank you for your continuing collaboration. Now, I'm trying to move the slides as well. Taking a threat assessment approach to this analysis, we identify key areas for action at both EU and national levels, and we provide recommendations to address these developments and challenges. And so the insights emerging from this collaborative analysis not only highlight the complexities of the MDMA market today, but also offer a foundation for future interventions, initiatives to address those issues. And so the work is included in the operational action plans of the European Multidisciplinary Platform Against Criminal Threats, MPACT. The MDMA module completes the 4th comprehensive overview of illicit drug markets in the European Union. And previous modules, again, for those of you who have followed our work in this area, previous modules have examined the markets for cocaine, methamphetamine, amphetamine, cannabis, heroin, and other opioids, as well as new psychoactive substances. Additionally, we have released resources, and those are available to you online on the drivers and facilitators of drug markets and key insights for policy and practice as well. In line with those previous modules and the previous work, we're launching the in-depth analysis of the MDMA market as an online resource. And while the presentations today will provide detailed insights from the analysis, please note that there is a wealth of additional information, additional materials, and those are available online. I encourage you to explore the resource, to interact with the data at your convenience. All data-driven figures are interactive, and you can download the information and the data for your use in your own presentations and learning materials. Today, alongside me, as a chair, I have 4 speakers presenting, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. And after all speakers have finished, we will have some time for questions and answers. And at this point, I will kindly ask you, please submit your questions in the questions and answers channel rather than in the chat, as it might be tricky to navigate the chat for this purpose. And please identify yourself when you write your question. Thank you very much. And with that, now I turn to our first speaker, Rita George. Rita is a scientific analyst on synthetic drugs at the EUDA, and she's the main author of this analysis we bring to you today. It's a pleasure to introduce Rita. She will introduce MDMA, providing an overview of its various forms, production, delving into the various issues surrounding production methods and availability of precursors.
Thank you very much, Teodora. Hello to everyone that's joining us online. So as Teodora said, I'll be mostly covering the sections of the report that deal with production, so production of MDMA in Europe. But perhaps it's important to start just at the very beginning, at how the MDMA market got established in Europe in the first place. So really, the story of MDMA starts in 1912 in Germany at the Merck pharma company. And here research chemists were looking for better drugs to control bleeding. They synthesize a number of compounds, and in the path to make one of such compounds, they synthesize MDMA. That synthesis is published in 1914. But here is important to note that the patent, the objective of the patent, is not MDMA at all. So MDMA at this point is just an intermediary, is just an adjunct to the synthesis of something else. And that's pretty much where it stays until the 1970s. At this point in the 1970s, it starts getting used as a psychopharmacological tool in some therapeutic circles, which were at the time using a number of psychoactive substances to, on one side, explore the mind, but also to find out new ways to perhaps help therapy. These therapeutic circles were mostly known in the United States, and the supply of MDMA to those circles was at that time made by research chemists. So these were chemists that had access to an academic lab, for example, or their own labs, and they were synthesizing small amounts and supplying these circles for either research or exploration. And that's pretty much where it stayed until the 80s. So as the house and techno scene is getting established in the US and also elsewhere, MDMA slowly finds its way to the dance floor. So at this point, obviously, these research chemists cannot supply this expanding consumer scene, consumer base, and so slowly underground labs start synthesizing MDMA and supplying it to its consumer base. And here Most of the production was occurring in the United States, and just a small portion of that production was making its way to Europe. Now, concerns associated with this expanding consumer base, as well as very heated debate on whether MDMA was a neurotoxic substance or not, led ultimately to its international scheduling. And so in 1986, MDMA becomes an internationally controlled drug, so an illicit drug everywhere. At this point, some underground labs were already being established in Europe also. These were mostly based in the Netherlands. And here the production may have expanded because in the Netherlands at that time, there was already some underground production, some illicit production of amphetamine. And so the expertise was there, the material was there, and importantly, the criminal distribution networks were there. So production of MDMA, illicit production in Europe expands at that time to a point where in 2008, organized crime groups based in Europe, mostly in the Netherlands, are considered to be some of the most relevant producers and exporters of MDMA worldwide. But on the licit side, a number of things are also happening at around these times. So in the 2010s, in the mid-2010s, a number of clinical trials which use MDMA start getting published. And these really reveal or further enhance the evidence base that MDMA may have a potential as a therapeutic in a number of mental health conditions, namely, for example, treatment-resistant PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Encouraged by these promising results, by the growing evidence base, in 2023, so not that long ago, the first medical prescription of MDMA is issued in Australia, and this is following an approval method over there, where some licensed therapists, namely psychiatrists, can use MDMA as an adjunct to therapy. So really what we see here in just 2 slides is MDMA starting from a very niche drug that's used in very niche circles to a wide global illicit market, and now possibly illicit pharmaceutical. So this was a large expansion in a short number of time. Importantly, this expansion also occurred with an important illicit economy being established. In Europe, our latest estimates, which are presented in this report, suggest that MDMA consumers have spent around 0.6 billion euros purchasing the drug. And this corresponds more or less to 72.4 million tablets consumed in the EU. But obviously, we know that a lot of the production goes outside, so a lot of more tablets consumed elsewhere in the world. What this number does not show is not only the significant profits that are made by criminal organizations by producing and distributing across this substance across the globe, but also how much of it is consumed across the globe. So it's established where it came from, but what is it? What is MDMA? Essentially, MDMA is a synthetic drug. Structurally, so in terms of its chemical structure, it's not that different from amphetamine or methamphetamine, even though in terms of effects, it can vary. It's like all amines, it can occur as a free base or as a salt. Now, if we're talking about the free base, we're talking mostly about a colorless oil that is insoluble in water, and therefore we're not talking about a consumer product. So this oil cannot be consumed, not even by vaporization, which is very often called free basing, because the boiling point is too high, really. So this is not a consumer product at all. But if you treat this molecule with an acid, typically hydrochloric acid, you get a white powder normally, or brownish crystals. And these crystals are indeed soluble in water. They can be consumed, sold directly to the consumer as crystal or as powder, almost always orally. They can also be pressed into tablets. And here is the very well-known ecstasy tablets. So how do you make ecstasy? So how do you get ecstasy at a clandestine level? So the most important thing to memorize is that there is a very important chemical called PMK, which is essential to this manufacturing. PMK can be converted to MDMA by all sorts of different pathways, typically these ones that I'm showing you here: Locard synthesis, cold method, aluminum amalgam, or high pressure reductive amination. And these are recipes really that are common to the synthesis of a number of other phenethylamines, like methamphetamine, for example. So you use different ingredients, but essentially these same for recipes. PMK is essential to this synthesis. Obviously, recognizing these and wanting to limit the illicit production of MDMA, authorities have placed this chemical under international control. So it's illegal to trade it. It's illegal to purchase it. There are ways, however, to make it. The earliest methods that are known to synthesize PMK and then MDMA start from traditional precursors. So this is safrole and piperonal, both of which can be derived from natural products. The sassafras tree that produces the sassafras oil, or dill, vanilla, and pepper. So these products have commercial applications, for example, in the perfume industry, etc., and they can be converted in PMK through a number of processes. Whenever there was an international shortage in these chemicals, there would be typically an international shortage of PMK and therefore of MDMA. To counteract this, clandestine chemists could do several things. One option would be to just come up with a whole new synthetic pathway, but that involves significant spend in time, a lot of optimization, losses of profits, etc. So one other alternative was just to go and change the molecule of PMK, to modify the molecule of PMK enough so that it wouldn't be the molecule that is internationally controlled. Okay, so just adding something to the chemical structure that made this molecule not so much legal, but illegal. We call those substances designer precursors, not because they're in any way special, but just because they are designed to circumvent legislation. We can see this happening here very clearly. So what I'm showing you here is the seizures of precursors that are communicated by the member states to the European Commission every year. And so in the quantities seized, we see the nature of each one of the MDMA precursors. So in 2013, we still have some safrole being seized, but that slowly really completely disappears, and we're getting through 2023, where almost virtually all the quantity of MDMA precursors that were seized in Europe were designer precursors. So really a very clear trend of using designer precursors rather than your traditional precursors, safrole, etc. Another thing to notice in here also is the sheer amounts that have been seized. So if you look in the period between 2018 and 2022, 51 tons of MDMA precursors seized in Europe. But then if you go to 2023, larger amounts than in the 5 years previous. Of course, we know that these 5 years included the pandemic years. and these years coincided also with the closing of recreational venues where MDMA is likely to be a consumed substance, as we'll see later on. But despite the fact that there was reduced production at this site, 2023 really remains as a historical record in terms of the quantities of MDMA precursor seeds. So clearly an interest from organized crime in Europe to import these ingredients to then produce MDMA. Where do these precursors come from? Well, systematic data is not collected on this matter, but whenever it's known, whenever the origin of precursor chemical shipments is known, it typically comes from China. So it comes in small amounts or very large amounts at the ton level. I'm showing you there a stop shipment that occurred in Luxembourg of PMK ethyl glycidate. So remember, one of those designer molecules where PMK is slightly modified with an additional part on the molecule, let's call it like that. So the precursor suppliers know that they're engaging in illicit activity because they provide all the paperwork and they very often offer to mislabel these products. These chemicals are shipped to various EU countries, and they're imported many times by companies that are established on purpose just for the import of these precursors and to their transfer to drug manufacturers. A lot of times, very legitimate courier companies are transporting these chemicals from point A to point B without their knowledge. Once you get your PMK precursors, so your designer precursors, the first step in synthesizing would be to transform these into PMK. That PMK is then used in the synthesis process by any one of those 4 methods that I showed you. The oil is made, it's purified, it's crystallized, so we add the hydrochloric acid, like I told you before, to make the oil into a salt, and then that salt it's dried off and either tableted, making ecstasy tablets, or made into crystals and sold directly to the consumer. Most of the times, this is made by the high pressure method. So one of the 4 methods that I showed you there. This method can happen in small benchtop setups or large industrial reactors. I'm showing you a large industrial reactor too. This is pretty much the same method that's used for methamphetamine. The issue here is that when you're using it at industrial level, it requires investment in the equipment, and the process itself also requires some very expensive chemicals. Now, what we have seen happening over recent years is that even though this is the preferred method, whenever there's shortages of the chemicals needed for this or shortages of equipments, a number of things are done. One of the things is that, for example, trying to obtain the equipments from legitimate or semi-legitimate companies in China that can produce this type of industrial chemical reactors, or simply just start exploring other methods. One of the methods that we've seen appearing once there is a shortage of equipment needed for the high pressure method is the cold method. Here what you do is you add up certain ingredients and the synthesis occurs in these fridge boxes. All of them are dangerous methods. This one produces hydrogen, for example, which is a very explosive gas. The aluminum amalgam method is also used now. These is very characteristic sludges created from the synthesis of MDMA using the aluminum amalgam method. Now, any of these methods produces chemical waste. Our estimates is that for 1 kilo of consumer products, so 1 kilo of the final MDMA that is being used for tableting, you, depending on the method used, between 21 to 58 kilos of chemical waste is produced. So if we think about the 72.4 million tablets that were produced in Europe in any given year, or consumed, not produced, consumed in Europe in a given year, we're talking about a significant amount of chemical waste produced. This chemical waste can be dumped, so placed in containers, in jerry cans, and just dumped somewhere in typically rural areas, sort of hidden from view. And here, I mean, you can see where those dumpings occurred several times. There were reports also of the chemical waste being placed in vans, for example, and then burnt. But there's also a significant amount of chemical waste that is discharged either directly on the soil or on the water supplies. And obviously this poses clear concerns regarding contamination of groundwaters, of the surrounding populations, etc. So where does production occur? It occurs in the beginning, mostly in the Netherlands, but it seems to be expanding elsewhere. So the first graph that I'm showing you there on the top level is the number of dismantled MDMA labs in the EU. I mean, you can see overall final numbers, but what you cannot see is the size of those labs. So even though the numbers of these labs vary according to the year, you can't see how much this graph doesn't show you how big these labs are. And the indications that we have from law enforcement is that really bigger and bigger units are being set up for the production of MDMA. The bottom graph shows you, in terms of percentage, where these labs were dismantled. And here, if in 2013 we saw that most of the labs were being dismantled in the Netherlands and Belgium, so that's the blue color and the greenish color there, as the timeline moves along, we start seeing more colors appearing on this graph, which means that more and more labs were dismantled elsewhere in Europe. So yes, traditionally and historically, production of the MDMA was occurring in the Netherlands, but this seems to be changing. And then this is just an example of that happening. So in January 2024, a big ecstasy lab was dismantled in Spain, where a large amount of MDMA was seized. And importantly, thousands of chemical waste was being dumped directly on the soil untreated. And even though these labs are set somewhere else, in this case, 2 Dutch nationals were involved in the cooking process. And okay, that is it from me. I can't pass this on. Okay, that is it from me. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for the comprehensive overview you provide there of production, including developments in methods and precursors. And we also appreciate your highlighting of illicit drug waste dumping, MDMA in this case, a significant environmental and public health risk. We may come back to that and the other aspects that you covered later in the Q&A section. Now I would like to invite Robert, my colleague Robert Petrancos, to turn on his microphone. He's our next speaker. Robert is a scientific analyst on drug crime and markets at the EUDA. He'll cover recent developments in trafficking and distribution patterns related to MDMA, highlighting that large quantities of this drug produced in Europe, as we just heard, they continue to be exported to markets outside the European Union, including Australia, Americas. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Theodora. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to be here to present several topics related to MDMA as Theodora mentioned, my contribution will focus on seizures, trafficking, and also on the presence of 2CB on the EU market. Please take a moment to observe the two charts on the screen. The chart on the left illustrates the number of seizures, while the one on the right, the seized quantities, both charts covering the same period, 2011-2022. In terms of number of seizures, as you can see on the chart, between 2011 and 2019, the total seizures reported in the EU, Norway, and Turkey increased gradually, reaching a historical peak in 2019. Then seizures started to decline in 2020, likely due to reduced demand during the COVID-19 restrictions. This drop seems short-lived, since in 2022 was noted again an increase comparing to 2021, but still the values remain below the level from 2019. Overall, the data suggests that the impact of COVID-19 at retail level may have been transitory. Please be aware that some countries have not reported consistently data, and this may affect the interpretation of this data. Let's now look at the quantities seized. Data on quantities are reported to EUDA in kilograms or in number of tablets. To allow comparative analysis for this section, the quantities reported in tablets were converted into kilograms. As you can see on the chart on the right, in the EU, peak quantities were seized between 2016 and 2019, around 3.3 tons per year. The Netherlands reported the majority of these seizures, about 1 ton per year, followed by France, Belgium, and Spain. During the same period, Turkey alone seized 1.8 tons on average per year, more than half the average quantity seized by the EU. As you can already note, similar to the number of seizures, from 2020, the decrease in the quantity seized reflect the reduced demand during the COVID-19. But still, the total seized quantities remain low also in 2022. This may indicate that the large wholesale seizures were also low in 2022. Between 2020 and 2022, 2.4 tons of MDMA were seized on average per year in the EU, with Spain reporting the largest average quantity, more than Netherlands. During the same period, Turkey, a large market and possible transit area for MDMA destined for other non-EU markets, continued seizing large quantities, about 2 tons on average per year. The preliminary data for 2023, which is not yet published and therefore not in the charts, indicates an increase in both the number of seizures and the quantity seized comparing to 2022. The EU, especially the Netherlands, remain an important origin of EMDMA trafficked worldwide. This slide and the next one show findings that rely heavily also on information on individual seizures provided to EUDA by WCO, World Customs Organization. The data set, which includes data from 2019 to 2022, helped us to better understand the role of the EU as global distribution hub. At least 95 non-EU countries reported seizures of MDMA originating from the EU. The Netherlands was the country from which the largest quantities were shipped, around 2.8 tons in total, followed by Germany, 1.4 tons, Bulgaria 1.3 tons, and Belgium the same, around 1.3 tons, as you can see on the graph on the screen. Germany and Bulgaria appear to be emerging as important distribution hubs for MDMA to both European and external markets. In the case of Germany, this is likely due to its proximity to the main production hubs, as well as the presence of large air hubs for major international courier, package delivery, and express mail services in the country. With regards to Bulgaria, its proximity to Turkey, where there is a large MDMA market, is a key factor. Related to transportation, MDMA is typically transported by land within the EU and to Turkey using cars, vans, lorries, while air cargo, commercial airplanes, even maritime shipping are used for destinations outside Europe. For example, air cargo is notably dominant for faraway destinations such as Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. Criminal networks often exploit post and parcel delivery services to traffic smaller quantities of MDMA to distributors or directly to consumers, both inside and outside the EU. Such parcels are frequently associated with the online drugs trade. There are cases when larger quantities are transported by parcel delivery. For example, in 2021, drug trafficking network from Netherlands tried to smuggle using parcel shipment services 47,000 tablets to Vietnam, and in another case, 14 kilograms to Laos. Therefore, attention should be directed also to this modus operandi. MDMA is frequently traded online. Social media platforms and instant messaging applications have become particularly dynamic channels to sell drugs, including MDMA. About drug markets, they continue to be active, and for MDMA, they offer both retail and wholesale amounts of MDMA tablets, but also powders or crystals. On the screen, you see a global map illustrating the non-EU destinations of MDMA produced within the EU. I trust that this map is self-explanatory and clearly shows that EU origin MDMA is destined for global markets. The WCO dataset confirmed that large quantities of MDMA were trafficked from EU to destination in North America, Southeast Asia, Oceania, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and East Asia. So basically, EU origin MDMA goes everywhere worldwide. Now, the data available underscore the importance of Turkey as a destination for MDMA shipments originating from the EU. Between 2019 and 2022, at least 2.8 tons of MDMA were shipped from the EU, out of which 1.3 tons were shipped from Bulgaria, but also large quantities were delivered directly from Netherlands. Important destinations for the EU origin MDMA are those with significant higher prices on the local markets, resulting in very high profit margins, such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan. Interesting destinations are those in Latin America. Recent years have been seen an increase in demand for synthetic drugs, such as MDMA, in Latin American countries. Recent indications suggest that the well-established cocaine trafficking routes between Latin America and Europe, previously thought to be one-way routes, may also be used to traffic MDMA, of course, in the opposite direction of the cocaine. Seizure data show that between 2019 and 2022, at least 1.2 tons of MDMA were trafficked from the EU to Latin America, such as in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina. Limited evidence suggests that on occasion, barter deals may take place where MDMA is exchanged for cocaine. For example, in 2020, an investigation in Brazil identified such barter deals between criminals in the state of Santa Catarina and Europe. Major Brazilian organized crime groups such as PCC and the PGC were reported to have links with the trade. Of course, the barter deals have not been sufficiently documented, but the potential importance of this modus operandi should not be underestimated. If we look back in time, 25 years ago, we can remember the heroin for MDMA barter deals between Turkish and Dutch criminal networks. And those deals may have actually contributed to the development of the today Turkish market for MDMA, which now appears to be one of the largest in Europe. Probably most of you have heard about 2CB, 2C, pink cocaine. It is not a new drug, but rather a new product. It's a mixture of various drugs. Actually, 2C or 2CB are phonetic transliterations of a series of psychoactive phenethylamines. 2CB products, despite their names, rarely contain the real 2CB or cocaine. Typically, they are like pink powders, often with a specific sweet smell from food coloring, containing mostly MDMA and ketamine, but also other substances. These mixtures were first reported around 2021 in Latin America. It was assumed at that time that drug traffickers were actually trying to recreate the properties of the real 2CB by mixing substances and in the same time avoiding less appealing feature for consumers, such as the pain while snorting. Since 2021, detections of pink powders were reported to the EU early warning system, mainly by Spain, but also in Czechia, Germany, Estonia, Hungary, the Netherlands, and many others. These detections have generally been small in quantities, with the powders containing a range of different substances, and as I said, always ketamine and MDMA, and typically other additional substances, including cocaine, caffeine, or even catenones. It's true that there were also a few cases involving larger quantities. Interesting cases was registered in 2023. A criminal network dismantled in Spain smuggled 2CB inside 3D printed double bottom packages to Colombia and Australia. And a similar modus operandi was uncovered several months later, where 3D printed figurines used to conceal 2CB were intercepted before being shipped to the United States, as you can see on the screen. This was my contribution. Thank you. Back to you, Theodora.
Thank you very much, Robert. Indeed, by examining the changes in supply, and later on we will cover those in the demand domain, we effectively gain a better understanding and insights into how this European production is integrated into a broader global MDMA, but also overall drug trade. As we heard, there are barters occurring, and so this really is an integrated global drug market. And the intervention here and the analysis which you will be accessing reveal both the challenges but also the strategies necessary for effective interventions. And now with that, I would like to invite our next speaker to get ready, Marianne Milligan. Marianne is a research analyst at Europol, and I'm really pleased to have a speaker from Europol with us today. Europol is the co-producer of this analysis, so welcome, Marianne. And she will cover the criminal networks involved in the MDMA market, exploring the dynamics of these organizations and their operations a bit more in detail. She will also discuss the concept of crime as a service, which highlights essentially how illicit activities are increasingly being offered across the different drug markets as a service, enabling a more sophisticated and, again, interconnected approach to MDMA trafficking. Over to you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Theodora. And maybe let me start by just making sure that you can hear me okay.
Absolutely.
I think so. Yeah, good. So greetings from The Hague. And as Theodora said, I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the criminal networks and the criminal services that we see being involved in the illicit trade of MDMA. Let me see that I think there's a little bit of lag here on the taking control of the presentation. Let me just get that to work. It doesn't seem to want to move. Now I think something is happening. Yes, thank you. Okay, so as you've heard, we see that EU-based criminal networks and actors are very well established in the production of MDMA, including supplying the global market with large volumes. You've seen the data that suggests that almost half of the MDMA labs dismantled in the world are based in the EU. And as with all illicit trade, the criminal networks engaged in MDMA are driven by the large profit opportunities. We see that Dutch-based criminal networks continue to dominate the production of MDMA, including operating and controlling production facilities outside the Netherlands, in, for example, Belgium. And this expansion of the Dutch-based criminal networks outside the Netherlands is likely a combination of them seeking to avoid targeted law enforcement actions in the Netherlands, as well as seeking to expand production. And we should also note that Dutch and Belgian criminal networks are often closely intertwined, making this expansion into Belgium natural. And while we see Dutch-based networks dominate the production of MDMA, we see a broad range of nationalities involved in the trafficking of MDMA. And as MDMA is, of course, trafficked globally from the EU, we also naturally see an involvement of non-EU actors, including then, for example, Asian networks who facilitate the trafficking of MDMA from the EU to Asian markets. The networks that are involved in the production and the trafficking of MDMA share several characteristics with other criminal networks involved in the illicit drug trade, and key being the adaptability that they display throughout the whole criminal process. We see, for example, how they use designer precursors to avoid scheduled substances, they introduce new technologies, and increasingly make use of combination laboratories to secure both markets and profits. An example of their adaptability is this exchange or barter that you heard Robert talk about, where we see an exchange of MDMA for cocaine with networks in Latin America. We also see that the networks active in both production and trafficking of MDMA are often polydrug in nature. As I said, it's not uncommon that we see combination labs. And here I would just like to draw your attention to another report that was published last year by Europol titled Decoding the EU's Most Threatening Criminal Networks, as this clearly illustrates the polydrug nature of the illicit trade. looking a little bit more in detail at the crime as a service, as I already mentioned, we see that the networks are highly adaptable, and we see this adaptability also in the specialization of services and the roles that are required to both produce and traffic MDMA. We see dedicated criminal actors providing services along the whole criminal process, including finding and securing locations for the laboratories, supplying precursors or designer precursors or chemicals, as well as the equipment needed. And this equipment includes, for example, then custom-based reaction vessels, glassware, and tableting machines. And we also see that the equipment is sourced both from within and outside the EU. Rita talked about how we see that production is adapted depending on what type of chemicals are available, and we also see that the criminal actors adjust the type of production method depending on what kind of facility or service and capacity that is available among the criminal actors. We see actors provide expertise needed for the production, as I said, as well as, for example, tableting, and we see that they have the capacity and the skill, for example, to custom-made tablets based on specific orders, and this might include adjusting potency, the shape, or the logos of the tablets. And then we see other actors specializing in the distribution and trafficking of the drugs, as well as the disposal of the waste. And then finally, we see actors that specialized in taking care of the laundering of the illicit funds that has been made then from the MDMA trade. And as with all drug trafficking, the criminal process is often closely connected with legal business structures. And of course, MDMA is no exception to that. Here we see that criminal actors, for example, misuse legal business structures to source needed tools and chemicals, and that they can either set up companies specifically to source these, or they may infiltrate or defraud existing companies. Another example of how they use legal businesses is the abuse of car rental companies, both to traffic MDMA, but also to use these vehicles for the disposal of chemicals. And maybe just to highlight an example of a network in this regard is which involved a Chinese criminal network that was involved in trafficking of synthetic drugs, including MDMA, from the EU to a range of different countries, including China, New Zealand, and Canada. And we saw that this network infiltrated 2 different companies in order to facilitate the importation of chemicals. And then they separately set up their own company to traffic the MDMA via postal and parcel services. Before I end, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight 3 recent reports, which will also bring you knowledge about drug trafficking, of course, in general, but also about MDMA. And the first one being the 4th edition of the EU Serious Organized Crime Threat Assessment, or SOCTA for short. The public version of this report was released very recently on 18th of March. You can find the document online. And this report focuses on threats linked to both specific crime areas as well as cross-cutting issues such as corruption and violence and the use of legal business structures. And on the trade of illicit drugs, you will find 4 sections, one on cocaine, one on cannabis, one on synthetic drugs and MPS, and then also one on heroin. The second report I want to highlight is the report on how actors use and misuse legal business structures. It's called Leveraging Legitimacy, How the EU's Most Threatening Criminal Networks Abuse Legal Business Structures. You can find this one also online. And then the last report I like to highlight is the report that Europol did last year, looking at the most threatening criminal networks in the EU. And I think this report clearly illustrates how agile and destructive criminal networks that are involved in the illicit drug trade can be. I'm going to stop there and hand over back to you, Theodora.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for sharing your insights with our attendees today into what methods criminal networks employ, and of course the implications for law enforcement as well. With that, I would like to invite my colleague João Matias to turn on his mic now. João is a principal scientific analyst on drug use and the drug problem here at the EUDA. He will focus on the characteristics of the MDMA retail market, examining key aspects such as pricing, distribution channels, and he'll also address the risks and harms associated with the consumption of this drug. João, over to you.
Thank you, Theo, and good morning to everybody. Yeah, from Theo's description, I feel like an outsider here, but happy to be in those shoes. So I come from the public health side of EUDA, and I think we have listened a lot on production, the market side of it. So I think it's also important to tell you a bit more about the current patterns of drug use of MDMA, why people use drugs, and also potential health risks related to that use. Two very important things before I start. So most important, I want to acknowledge the work of a lot of colleagues. Today I'm just the face, but I'm presenting data and facts from a lot of the work that my colleagues are doing, and I think this is important to stress. Second bit of information, I will be providing data and bits and pieces of information coming from different methods. And by saying this, these different methods cover different populations and have different coverages. So I'll be trying to highlight from where the information is coming from. Having said this, I will deeply dive into the use of MDMA at a global context. And so here we have the data from UNODC that estimates that around 20 million people have used MDMA products in the last year, a fairly stable number when looking to the previous estimates. Obviously, around COVID and with all the pandemic restrictions and closing of recreational settings and having no festivals going on, we had some decreases in use a bit all over. When we look at the differences in continents, we see that the largest proportions of users are mostly in East and Southeast Asia, but also North America, Western and Central Europe. You can also see from some of the comments in the chat here that most probably the products and the forms of MDMA used in these different regions might differ. And so probably the products we find in Europe are a bit different, but we will be covering that later on. National estimates of those who use drugs show that it's in Australia and New Zealand that we have the highest prevalence of use of MDMA. In terms of the quantities of MDMA seized worldwide, we had in 2021 12 tons, and this was a first decline after an increasing trend for a decade. And in between 2017 and 21, Europe accounted for almost around 50% of all MDMA seized in the world. When we look a bit more into the data we have for Europe, our last estimate shows that we have around 2 million people, young people that have used MDMA in the last 12 months. So MDMA is the second most commonly used stimulant in Europe after cocaine. Again, as for the global context, this has been a fairly stable number. We saw in the 90s a big increase in MDMA use. Then in the last years, decline because of COVID-related restrictions. And now more recent data, we are seeing the levels of use similar to the ones before COVID. When looking at another method that we, for example, just published last week data from wastewater from more than 100 European cities, we have that we have seen that the larger quantities of MDMA being used are mostly in cities in Belgium, Czechia, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, which mimics a bit the information we have from survey data. So wastewater is a very powerful tool, not to measure the millions of people that are using MDMA in a country, but it really tells you about emerging trends and changes in the market at city level. And I think this is important to stress. Data from the European Web Survey on Drugs, and this for the ones that do not know, it's a targeted survey, so not representative of the whole population, but it is a non-targeted survey that covers information from people who use drugs. And we had in 21 coverage of more than 30 countries and 100,000 people. We could see that the pattern of MDMA use in most cases was in combination with other substances, being alcohol, herbal cannabis, and tobacco, and more recently ketamine, the substances that are more commonly found when MDMA is used. Data from the web survey, but also from wastewater, shows that use goes up during weekends, which is no surprise because it's very much linked to recreational settings. And most people tend to use on their last occasion of use, on average, 1 tablet or 0.4 grams of crystals. I think I would also really like to stress here, because we do ask about the motivations why people use specific substances. And for MDMA, more than 80% declare that they've used to get high, to have fun, and for socialize. And I think this is also very important when describing the patterns of use and to reduce stigma about around those who decide to use drugs for any given reason. Also, from the web survey, the settings most commonly reported where MDMA is used are, no surprise, clubs, bars, and music festivals. I've just told you about the current and more recent trends about the patterns of drug use, of MDMA use, but I think it's also important to understand which types of forms and products we are talking about historically. Since the emergence of MDMA use in the 90s in Europe, traditionally it was mostly what's so-called ecstasy tablets were the most commonly form of MDMA used in Europe. But after following a lack of trust by those of you who decided to use MDMA back then, around the mid to late 2000s, we saw crystals and powders getting a bigger portion of the MDMA market in Europe. And here in this graph, you can see the distribution of MDMA forms reported in the European Web Survey of Drugs. And you can see that is quite a mix of tablets, pills, crystals, and powders being used in most countries. In terms of how people declared that, how they got their MDMA products, mostly declaring that they got it from known sellers and they got it through face-to-face contacts. At the moment, we are also seeing a novelty in the products being available, and here is just a picture of some MDMA lollipops containing MDMA seized by the Belgian Federal Police. When looking at, and sorry, I need to go back. If it's possible. Somehow it's not moving. Yeah, it is moving now. In terms of how much MDMA we are seeing in our data in an ecstasy tablet. So here you can see a graph with data coming from law enforcement and customs on the milligrams per tablets on average found on the European market. And you can see that we have an increase since 2011 till 2019, and on the content of MDMA present in tablets. And then after COVID and also after PMMK being internationally controlled, we have seen a decrease. I think it's important to stress that the average content of MDMA has been increasing. I mean, till 2019. In just for reference, in 2011, ecstasy tablets contain on average between 35 milligrams and 120 milligrams of MDMA, while however, in 2019, those varied from 120 to 202 milligrams. So what does this mean in practice for those who decide to use? It means that those buying ecstasy tablets in Europe at the moment probably would obtain products that contain up to almost the double of the highest amount of MDMA recorded around 2010. And I think this is quite important to stress. And this also I would like to point out, because this is for those who decide to use, it's quite important. While the individual tablets weight cannot be a direct predictor of how much MDMA is present in a tablet, at population trend level, this trend seems to be consistent when comparing larger ecstasy tablets with smaller tablets. Also, we do have a partnership with the TEDI network, which is the European network of drug checking services running in Europe. And the data that we get from those services is quite consistent with the one I've just told you about. So generally in agreements that and for reference, in 2023, around 40% of the MDMA tablets tested by drug checking services contain between 100 and 150 milligrams of MDMA. I think also quite important to mention that still we have quite a lot of MDMA tablets available on the market that have high strength. And by high strength, we mention tablets that are over 150 milligrams. And some of these, and I cannot seem to be able to share the next slide. Thank you. And so it's important to stress that some of these high dose tablets might be related to an increased health risk for those who decide to use them. And by this, we refer to acute physical and psychological discomforts, such as anxiety. Although we do see these tablets available on the market, it's very important to stress that health consequences related to MDMA use are quite rare when compared to other illicit drugs. Deaths reported to our monitoring system are very, very rare. And when they are reported, they are mostly in a context of polydrug use, so in the presence of other substances. When we look at the treatment data related to MDMA use, we have typically less than 1% of those who enter treatment for the first time that their reason to go for treatment is because of MDMA use. Important to stress, some of those high-strength pills have the tablets are scored so that people can divide them into smaller portions. And even sometimes some of those tablets contain stamping on the quantity of MDMA present, but this is not always very accurate. And this is important to mention. And so I would like to also to stress that the importance of having harm reduction services available at EU level. And here I want to stress also drug checking services, where those who have substances and those who plan or not plan to use a specific drug can go to those services and get their substances tested and get a harm reduction intervention around the products and possible adulterations found in the products they have. So I think this is quite important. And my next slide. Just to finish, in terms of the prices of those who reported. So it's important to stress that the data on price for all drugs, but also MDMA, is a bit scarce. So please bear that in mind. But when looking at index trends since 2012, you can see that the prices were quite stable. On average, although there are some differences between countries, you can get between 4 euros and 20 euros a tablet and 6 to 50 euros a gram of crystal. Seems to be cheaper on the dark net, but the levels of purity are unknown. Also, my last point, the data we got from the European Web Survey on Drugs, so from those who use drugs, the data on price is very consistent to the data we get from law enforcement and customs. And we did an analysis and by the different frequency of use, and we could see that those who tend to use MDMA more frequently are able to get MDMA for cheaper prices. And with this, I pass the floor to Theo. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, João. Indeed, it is great that you bring to our viewers the retail market perspective. And just a reminder to all at this point that the market concept we have applied to this module, but also in the in-depth analysis of the other drugs, of course, is very broad, encompassing production, trafficking, distribution, the retail market. So the market within its entirety, from wholesale to retail. And it was very important indeed to hear some of the analyses and some of the messages you passed to our viewers. Important to hear that high-dose MDMA tablets are still available, and so continue posing serious risks, increasing the likelihood for adverse outcomes. And that's why harm reduction measures, as you highlighted, like drug checking services, are so important for people who use this drug. I would like to move on, conscious of the time, to Rita now for her concluding slides with the key messages from this analysis and also the recommendations we identify for action. Rita, over to you for that.
Dora, it's my honor now to take us to the conclusion of the webinar and also the conclusions of the report. So just as a reminder of what we shared here in the webinar, we shared that the MDMA consumer market in the EU is pretty stable. It generates large profits. We estimated that about 72.4 million MDMA ecstasy tablets were consumed in the EU. That's our latest estimate. Production of MDMA for domestic use and also for beyond occurs in EU territory, mostly Netherlands, or historically Netherlands and Belgium, but there's clear evidence that we're presenting that this phenomenon is spreading elsewhere. MDMA mostly made by high pressure methods, but these change as soon as there is a change in the access to equipment or the access to precursors, designer precursors being by far the most used precursors to produce MDMA here in Europe. And when known, these mostly originate in China. And obviously the production generates issues of public health harms associated with dumpings, etc. We've heard from Robert how the EU is the point of origin of MDMA trafficking flows worldwide. This has been happening for a while, but one of the big novelties that this analysis has shown is that barter deals may be occurring with criminal networks in Latin America, so the exchange of cocaine for MDMA. This is an emerging occurrence. And from João, we've heard that MDMA prevalence has been stable, other than areas, time stamps where the pandemic was happening, for example, and use has been mostly associated with recreational settings, so consumers who manifest a wish to have fun mostly. And whilst the price of MDMA has been pretty consistent in the EU throughout a number of years, so it varies from country to country, but pretty stable at a national level. The content of ecstasy tablets has changed and is really responsive to changes in the market, including to shortages or availability of precursors. So from this analysis, we anticipate that the shift in production methods will continue to happen every time there is a shortage of equipment or precursors, etc. These networks seem to be incredibly dynamic. They quickly adjust, even though some reduction in supply sometimes is seen. We will look very carefully in this apparent expansion of MDMA trafficking into countries in Latin America, and we predict really that innovation in the use of precursors and developments in production techniques will continue. So here, these groups trying to make the production more efficient. So what can be done to mitigate these issues? I mean, definitely improving the intelligence picture on MDMA trafficking, strengthening responses in terms of supply and security, so really focusing on high-value targets, for example, but also strengthening international cooperation. We've just heard these potentially new partnerships with Latin American countries, for example, incredibly important. Also, investment in capacity building, so law enforcement skills, etc., including lab dismantling elsewhere, rather than the countries that are perhaps more used to these dismantling these sites, to other areas of Europe too, where these labs are now being set up. But then last and definitely not least, strengthening policy, public health and safety responses, and this includes promoting prevention, promoting harm reduction, making consumers aware of the health risks associated if they choose to consume the substance, and also a need to look a little bit further into the environmental impact of MDMA production. And that's really it from us. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Theo.
Thank you very much. Rita, can you hear me? I had trouble turning on the mic. I think you do. With that, we are in the final part of today's launch webinar, and we have allocated a few minutes for questions from the attendees, from you who have joined us online and who have stayed with us to this point. And for those of you who will stay until the end, we have 10 minutes. And for that, I would like to open the question and answer part now. And I have several questions which have come in the Q&A channel. The first one is for Rita. I will read it out. In the user community, there is talk that the MDMA nowadays is different from previously. Could different precursors result in different composition between R and L MDMA, or is it all MDMA still racemic? Rita, if you could take
so
that.
Thank you very much for the question. In fact, there's very little data on the enantiomeric composition of MDMA. So if you look at the MDMA chemical structure, it's normally drawn flat, but it's actually a 3D structure. For those who are not aware of these different forms, it means that at 3D level, some parts of the molecule are facing forward, some are facing backwards, and this makes the exact same chemical structure sometimes behave in different ways, and that's what we call the R-MDMA or the S-MDMA. So there's very little data on the composition of the MDMA in the EU market, but the data that does exist suggests that the MDMA is racemic, so both forms present, more or less in 50-50 ways. If you use enantiomerical pure precursors, you get enantiomerical pure products, but this is not what we're seeing from the precursor side. So typically the methods that are used, unless specific steps are taken for it, which we are not seeing at all, the MDMA that is circulating should be in principle enantiomeric. So if the consumer community is talking about differences in their experience of taking this substance, perhaps it's due to any other type of issues, maybe stronger tablets or adulteration in any way, and in that case, then harm reduction services will be obviously the first port of call. Drug checking services can easily confirm what might be happening there, even though enantiomeric composition is typically not checked.
Thank you, Rita. Another question has come in from colleagues in Cyprus. One of the biggest challenges we have in Cyprus is, and I assume this is for the whole of the EU customs community, is the control movement of goods between EU member states and consequently trafficking of MDMA and other drugs trafficking. Has any EU country implemented any effective measures that you're aware of to intervene and control effectively for this intra-community movement of goods or parcels? And I would like to invite Robert to address this question, please.
Thank you for the question, a quite interesting one. As I also mentioned in my presentation, when we speak about transport within EU, MDMA is mainly transported by land, cars, lorries, buses, but also via postal and parcel packages. The movement of goods and people within the Schengen EU area makes traditional border checks inefficient for detecting and preventing the trafficking of MDMA and, of course, other drugs. So this means that law enforcement needs to focus on alternative methods to tackle this issue, such as investigations, intelligence gather, and extremely important increased cooperation between member states. As example of efforts, the hubs for distribution, like the one from Netherlands and Germany, make a lot of effort in detecting the drugs in parcel packages. Every year they seize large quantities of drugs in packages. They try to improve constantly the risk analysis and the detection methods. And as a more concrete example, as I know in Netherlands, police, customs and public prosecution service are working together in a team, I think it's called HARP, Hit and Run Post Team, that is specifically designed against drug smuggling by post. And I think that it started operating from last year. So I think these type of examples are quite efficient, but the most important one, I think, is the cooperation. It requires a quick exchange of information, both on operational and strategic areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I'm conscious we're running out of time, but I would like to pose one more question, which has just come in through the channel. And this is from a colleague at UNODC. Last year prevalence is rather low for Portugal, while wastewater is rather high. For other countries, the ranking seems to be more in parallel between prevalence and wastewater. The same is also the case for cocaine, for comparison. What is the reason for these differences? João, could I invite you to share your thoughts on that, please?
Thanks, Theo, and thanks, Thomas, for that. If there was someone who would pick that, I knew it to be you. That's also why I mentioned in the beginning, it was very important to differentiate the coverages of the different methods we were presenting. So national household surveys represent figures at national level. Wastewater, it's city level data. Having said this, in Portugal, the last survey at national level was carried out in 22, and the last wastewater data that we just published is 24. And it's true that MDMA use was highest in Lisbon than in most other European cities that participated. It is also very important to stress that when looking at wastewater analysis, we do compare larger cities against smaller cities, and we do see that the levels of use in bigger cities are much higher than in smaller cities. Obviously, this, when presenting the data at city level, you can have cities from a country like Lisbon in Portugal that show high levels of use, but then when you look at national household survey data that covers also the rural areas and possibly parts of the country where MDMA is not so present, or cocaine, the levels will be obviously smaller. So that's why when you look at one figure for a country that just reflects the number of those who use drugs, it might not give you the full picture. That's also why we always have this complementary approach of combining survey data, wastewater, and having also web service to give us a bit more details on the patterns of drug use. So this is the reason why you can get sometimes different results from wastewater or traditional surveys.
Thank you very much, João. I think we're we're on time finishing this launch webinar today. I would not wish to go over time. I would like to thank you all and encourage you indeed to dig into the data, into the analyses that were presented today. They're very rich, well-structured, well-presented. They contain interactive elements, as noted earlier, so you will hopefully enjoy interacting with the content that we have curated and presented to you today. Apologies that we didn't go exhaustively through all the questions posted in the Q&A channel, but we're simply running out of time just now. And I would like to encourage you to get in touch if your question was not answered, or if you have follow-up questions to pose to the speakers. I would like to close this launch webinar by thanking all speakers, of course, my colleagues at the EUDA and also Europol, who made this production of this module possible. I also extend my sincere gratitude to the member states and their collaborators in Europe and beyond. A special thank you to the support team that facilitated the launch. Thank you very much. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to all the online attendees for taking the time today to participate and for your interest, of course, in the work of the EUDA and the joint work with Europol. Thank you very much, everyone.